the slave of fantasy, passion, and convention. Not in touch with that mysterious inner self. That the individual is wasteful, hedonistic, and destructive. And when I think of individuals, I think of one person in this sense. He's a fictional, well, I won't get there yet. We'll get there yet. But, so we kind of have this idea of conformism. These are guys in the 1950s. I mean, I love hats. I wish hats would come back cool, because the hats were awesome. But, so in thinking this, we think of individuals nowadays as folks who tend to stand out from the crowd. But for Merton and his thought, individuals are those who join the crowd. Though Merton supposedly left the world he thinks he left the world, but as time passed, especially in the 1950s and 60s, he had opportunities to leave the monastery for short trips. He was always tempted to leave the monastery for another monastery, but he was kept in check by his abbot. So when he left the monastery, he was exposed to developments within American society, at least within the confines of Kentucky and Louisville. When he would go into town, he would peruse magazines in the library. He knew of developments within the peace movements, not just from the news, but from participants in it through correspondence. Later, when he was more independent, when he lived in the Hermitage, he had opportunities to leave and watch TV. And even though he regretted doing so, he usually, not because of what he saw, but just because he felt it was a violation of trust and of his vocation. But he would say, oh well, and in jest he would chalk it up to the spirit of freedom in the post-Vatican II era. A couple of times he said, I guess that's what we do now. So this issue of the person in relation to the community was important to him. I mean, he lived in community, but in later years somewhat separated from the monastic community. But it was an important issue for him. And what he was worried about as a teacher involved in the formation of monks is that he didn't want to create automatons, but he wanted to create or have the monastery help create free persons who are in the process of discovering their identities in God as part of a community. And I think we can break down his thought in this way. So here we go. False self is individual, collective, meaning part of a collective, not a community, just a collective of individuals, and it is a form of slavery. And then there's the true self, who is a person who lives in community and is free. And so this was what he wanted to create within the monastery, and thought society at its best could do as well, even though frequently failed, as well as the monastery did too. But so there's the difference: false self, true self, individual person, collective community, slavery, freedom. And so the individual lives in isolation and alone, disconnected from his or her true self, from God, from others. He says individuals are empty, alienated human beings who have lost their center and extinguished their own inner light to depend in abject passivity upon the mass in which they cohere without affectivity or intelligent purpose. Now, to me, if you follow all that, there's one fictional person that I think epitomizes that. That's Don Draper. Now, everybody know who Don Draper is? Generally, this is Don Draper, who is the main character of the AMC TV show Mad Men. Comes on AMC Saturday nights at 9 o'clock. The last season begins this Sunday. It's on Netflix, so you can go back and watch. You can do, what do they call it? They call it now where you can watch 7 episodes all in a row. A binge, yeah, binge viewing, yes. You can do a binge viewing of Mad Men and catch up before Sunday. But to me, Don Draper, this fictional character, even though he was 21st century character in a 21st century drama, he, to me, is empty and alienated and out of touch with his true identity. And if you are familiar with the show, he is out of touch with his identity on more than one level. He's not who he says he is. But he is, to me, a great example of what I think Merton was talking about in our own day. Now Merton works out all this thinking in his meditation called Rain in the Rhinoceros. And in this meditation, it's in It's in raids on the unspeakable. In the meditation, rain represents solitude, it represents nature, it represents all that is real. And what is real is very important to him. And even in the passage I read from the Seven-Story Mountain, he talks about this self that he wants to be is unreal. That's where his energy is. So being real is important. And the rhinoceros in this meditation refers to a play by a French playwright named Ionesco, in which everyone but the main character named Berenger turns into a rhinoceros. Berenger feels the pull of joining the herd, but resists the temptation and retains his humanity. And the rhinoceroses are those who have lost their personhood and have become individuals and have joined the collectivity. Now, in the same collection as Rain and the Rhinoceros is in this book, there's another meditation whose subject is a Nazi war criminal. And the title of the essay is A Devout Meditation in Memory of Adolf Eichmann. Many of y'all might remember him. During World War II, Eichmann oversaw the logistics of deporting Jews from ghettos and to concentration camps in Eastern Europe. He escaped to, I think, Argentina and was captured in 1960 by the Mossad. His trial was a media event, and he was found guilty and hanged in 1962. And I think Merton saw Eichmann as the supreme example of the individual within the collective who gives up their humanity, who becomes a rhinoceros. And the thing that strikes Merton the most about Eichmann was his sanity, that Eichmann was not crazy, he was not insane. And he says, I'll read a little bit. He says it better than I do. He says, one of the most disturbing facts that came out in the Eichmann trial, this was written in 65 or so, the trial was in the early 60s. One of the most disturbing facts that came out in the Eichmann trial was that a psychiatrist examined him and pronounced him perfectly sane. I do not doubt it at all, and that is precisely why I find it disturbing. If all the Nazis had been psychotics, as some of their leaders probably were, their appalling cruelty would have been in some sense easier to understand. It is worse to consider this calm, well-balanced, unperturbed official conscientiously going about his desk work, his administrative job, which happened to be the supervision of mass murder. He was thoughtful, orderly, and unimaginative. He had a profound respect for system, for law, and order. He was obedient, loyal, faithful officer of a great state. He served his government well. And then he goes on to say and ask, he says, so I ask myself, what is the meaning of a concept of sanity that excludes love, considers it irrelevant, and destroys our capacity to love other human beings, to respond to their needs and their sufferings, to recognize them as persons, to apprehend their pain as one's own? Here's a sane person who, as he said, was following orders. How did that happen? And Merton sees, again, this is in the early 1960s, he sees a pattern in his own society. I think he saw a pattern in the church to some degree, of people just following orders. He says, the sanity of Eichmann is disturbing. We equate sanity with a sense of justice, with humaneness, with prudence, with the capacity to love and to understand. We rely on the sane people of the world to preserve it from barbarism, madness, destruction. And now it begins to dawn on us that it is precisely the sane ones who are the most dangerous. It is the sane ones, the well-adapted ones, who can, without qualms and without nausea, aim the missiles and press the buttons that will initiate the great festival of destruction that they, the sane ones, have prepared. What makes us so sure, after all, that the danger comes from a psychotic getting into a position to fire the first shot in a nuclear war? Psychotics will be suspect. The sane ones will keep them far from the button. No one suspects the sane, and the sane ones will have perfectly good reasons, logical, well-adjusted reasons for firing the shot. They will be obeying sane orders that have come sanely down the chain of command, and because of their sanity, they will have no qualms at all. When the missiles take off, then there will be no mistake. Kind of an indictment of that time period, keeping in mind the book was published in 65, 3 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and a year after, there's Eichmann, Dr. Strangelove. Peter Sellers. We just watched that a couple nights ago. Pretty fun. So he was not the only one concerned about it. Stanley Kubrick was as well. Actually, Peter Sellers plays 3 different roles. He plays Dr. Strangelove, the president, and a officer who's located on a military base having to deal with the crazy person. So, Dr. Strangelove. So, now we live on the other side of the Cold War. I lived through the last of it. I remember the tense situation that existed in 1981 when Poland's government declared martial law and Soviet forces gathered at the border. I have memory of that. And I also remember movies like World War III with David Soul and Rock Hudson. And also remember the movie with Jason Robards, The Day After. So maybe from this distance we can maybe ask ourselves what could have been there another way? I don't have the answer. I just off that up as a question. Now the last related topic is freedom. The last years of Merton's life were lived in the late 1960s. He died in 1968 after having witnessed the worst of that year. He was actually out and about when Martin Luther King was assassinated. And there had actually been talk about after King left Memphis that he would actually go and visit Merton, but that didn't happen. But he saw the worst of that year, some of it from afar in Asia. And so in the 1960s, the civil rights movement was underway. The women's movement was gaining energy. The hippies were out there, just living it up, enjoying all that freedom. I didn't live through it. I know some of y'all did, so y'all have to tell me. I know it wasn't all. I know it wasn't like Mad Men, probably. But so freedom was in the air. Talk of freedom was in the air. Now William Shannon, the Merton scholar mentioned, he delineates 3 phases or stages in Merton's thinking about freedom and how he understood it. In the first stage, freedom is the freedom to do what he wanted. And that's kind of the first half of the 7-Story Mountain is him doing what he wanted and finding that it was insufficient for his happiness. And so this, in this first stage, freedom is to do what he wanted, and this he found out to be a pseudo-freedom. He had the illusion of freedom, but it was just slavery to all sorts of, as he would say, passions and things like that. The second phase of freedom he found within the 4 walls of the monastery. It was obedience to the rule of St. Benedict and obedience to his superiors. Merton, first abbot, said his first rule for monks was to do as you're told, and his second rule for monks was to do as you're told. So that's the freedom that Merton found in those early to mid years in the monastery. And for a while, that was enough. But as he grew, I think, and aged, he discovered a third stage of freedom, which is what he would say the response to the inner truth and unity found in contemplation. That through this, he would say, life of contemplation, we can experience a true sense of freedom. We can know ourselves, our true selves, and we are truly free. And it's like what Jesus said, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. That's on the main building at the University of Texas, actually, on the tower. Some of y'all walk past those words, but I think that's what, if you know the truth, then you are truly free. And if we find the truth within ourselves, as ourselves having this particular sort of relationship with God at the center of our being, then we are free. Now, in his later years, he became worried about Gethsemane. When he was 53, he had been there since he was 26 or so, about half his life. He'd lived through where they were really still living at like 19th century or 16th century monks. He lived all that through the changes, Vatican II changes that he in part helped bring about. I mean, his writings brought in money to the monastery. The monastery was able to do particular things because of the money he made for it. So he'd lived through a lot of changes. He'd seen the post-World War II boom. But in the early 1960s, that boom ebbed, as it did for all churches, practically all churches. Monks started to leave. Now they've gotten up to 200, and then they started to gradually drift away. New vocations stopped, or at least didn't show up quite as often. And the ones that stayed, he feared, were using the monastery to find a place of security within all these other changes of society, Vatican II, and things like that. And so in his language, he feared it would become a collectivity of individuals rather than a community of free persons trying to discover God within themselves. But in his time there, as much as the monks might be looking for security, things had changed. as I said.